Let me ask you a serious question. What would you do if a corrupt, power-hungry HOA president shot your dog in broad daylight, and the cops just let him walk away with a smirk? Most people would throw a punch, break his jaw, and end up in a jail cell. But I didn't say a word. I just went home, sat in silence, and decided to legally, systematically erase his entire existence. He thought his six-figure banking job and his neighborhood authority made him an untouchable god. He didn't realize I was about to expose a web of federal tax fraud so deep that it would tear his life apart. I didn't just take his house. I took his career, his marriage, and his freedom without laying a single finger on him. Here is exactly how I pulled it off. The day Richard stood on his front porch, relaxed, untouchable, wearing that slow, practiced smile that said he had already won. I did not say a single word back. I just looked at him. And in that silence, standing on the sidewalk outside the house he had turned into his personal kingdom, I made the kind of decision you do not come back from. The kind that starts completely quiet and ends with official vehicles in the driveway. Watching a man carry the last of everything he owns in a single cardboard box while his neighbors stand on their lawns and stare. But to understand how we got here, I need to take you back to where this all started. I want you to picture the neighborhood I moved into 6 years ago. Wide, clean sidewalks. Mature oak trees lining both sides of every block. The kind of place where people still wave from their driveways on Saturday mornings and kids ride bikes until the streetlights come on. I worked hard for that house, no family money, no lucky break. Just years of grinding and saving until I finally closed on a small corner lot with a fenced backyard and enough room to breathe. It was mine. Really mine. And the thing that made it feel like a home from the very first week was Duke. Duke was a 5-year-old golden retriever with exactly one personality setting: complete joy. He had this habit of sitting directly on your feet when you stood still, quietly claiming you as his person, like the ground itself wasn't good enough for him unless you were standing on it. Every morning he brought me one of his toys as I came downstairs. Not to play, just to hand me something. Because that was simply how he operated. He was my routine, my reset, the reason a quiet house never actually felt empty. And I know how that sounds. But if you have ever had a dog like that, you already understand. This story, as it was originally shared, reflects one person's account of events to mine. One perspective, one version of what happened. I want to be clear about that. Now, the whole, every suburban neighborhood has one, and ours had Richard. And here's what I have to be honest about. Even now, Richard was not obviously dangerous. He was silver-haired, mid-60s, and carried himself with the specific confidence of a man who had spent decades being the most prepared person in every room and knew it without needing to say so. When I first moved in, he appeared at my door with a decent bottle of red wine and spent a full 20 minutes asking genuine questions about my background, my plans for the yard, whether I had family nearby. He made real eye contact. He laughed easily. He listened the way people listen when they are actually interested, not just waiting to talk. He had run the HOA for over 11 years. Meetings started exactly on time. The community newsletter was well written. The neighborhood was immaculate. People thanked him repeatedly, publicly, and he had built a reputation so solid that questioning Richard felt like questioning the sidewalks. Just part of the landscape. Just how things were. He thought that reputation was permanent. He had no idea it had an expiration date, or that I was the one holding it. What I noticed, over time, were small patterns. The way he paused just a half second too long before agreeing with someone at a meeting. The way that easy smile surfaced right before he redirected a conversation he did not want to continue. The way he handled financial discussions with just enough technical language to make the room nod and move on. I filed those things under personality quirks and kept going about my life. Duke had pushed through our front door once before. The latch did not always catch cleanly on windy mornings. He had spent 20 minutes investigating a neighbor's rose bushes and come trotting back like he had discovered a new continent. We fixed the latch. We thought we had, on a Saturday afternoon in early fall, I was in the backyard when I heard something from the front of the house. I will not describe what happened the way it lives in my memory. What I will tell you is that Duke had gotten out again. He had wandered across the street the way he always moved, slowly, tail going, completely harmless, to sniff the grass at the edge of Richard's lawn. What Richard chose to do next was not impulsive. The calmness with which he did it told me everything about the kind of man I was dealing with. A man who had already decided, long before that afternoon, exactly what he would do if given the opportunity. By the time the responding officers arrived, his account was polished and ready. He had feared for his life. The animal was aggressive. He had no choice. He delivered every word of it with such practiced, convincing sincerity that the matter was closed before the sun went down. They left. He stood on his porch. That smile. Duke was no longer with me. I walked back inside, sat down at my kitchen table, stared at his water bowl near the back door still full, because I had filled it that morning and he had not come home to drink from it. And I sat there in that silence for a very long time, not the kind of rage that burns. Something colder, something that had already begun making a list. I decided, in that quiet kitchen, that I was going to find out everything there was to know about Richard. Every dollar, every decision, every thread I could legally pull. I had absolutely no idea how many threads there were going to be. The days after what happened to Duke were the strangest of my life. Not because I was falling apart, though part of me was, but because on the outside, I was completely functional. I went to work. I made coffee. I waved at neighbors from the driveway. Nobody would have looked at me and seen anything other than a person going about their week. Inside, I was constructing something. I started with the whole finances. Homeowners have the legal right to request the association's financial records in most states, and I filed that request in writing on a Monday morning, formal, polite, completely by the book. Richard would have received notice of it. I imagine he glanced at it for about 3 seconds and figured it was a grievance move from the neighbor with the dog situation. Probably expected me to get frustrated and go away. He was spectacularly wrong about that. The documents arrived 3 weeks later. I spread them across my dining room table, the table that now felt enormous and too quiet, and I started going through every single line. I am not an accountant, but I am patient, and once I start pulling a thread, I do not stop. And here is where it gets interesting. There was a property management company receiving a consistent, significant payment every single month. A number that made me set my pen down and stare at the page. When I searched the company name, the registered owner was someone I did not recognize, but a few minutes in public records told me exactly who that name was connected to. Richard's brother-in-law. The same HOA he ran, the same funds every homeowner on that block contributed to, had been moving money every single month into a company that funneled it directly into his own family. 4 years. I want you to really picture Richard at this exact moment. Still running meetings. Still smiling at neighbors from his driveway. Still sending that newsletter. Completely confident. Completely at ease. Because as far as he knew, the situation with Duke was handled, and his life was exactly as he had arranged it. He had no idea what was being built around him. Now, stay with me here, because this is the part I still think about. I almost stopped. I know that sounds strange. I had found something real, something that could genuinely hurt him. But I sat at that table late on a Thursday night. Documents spread everywhere. Duke's collar still on the hook by the front door where I had not been able to move it. And I thought, what if this just creates a legal nightmare? What if I do this and nothing actually changes, and I end up the angry neighbor who made a scene? There was a real, genuine part of me that almost folded everything up and walked away. I mean that completely. I almost let it go. Hey, before we go any further, if this story is landing the way I think it is, a subscribe genuinely means everything on a channel this size. Okay, back to it because it is about to get so much worse. What stopped me was not anger. Anger had faded into something quieter by then. What stopped me was a simple, specific thought. Someone like Richard has been doing this for a long time, and he has gotten away with it because nobody has ever looked closely enough, or stayed patient enough, To finish what they started, I looked at Duke's collar on that hook. And I made my decision. I am thorough by nature. In this specific situation, it was the only quality that mattered. Because my gut told me for real, low, specific feeling that the HOA money was not the only place Richard had his hands somewhere they did not belong. I hired a private investigator. Quiet, professional, recommended through a contact. When I laid out what I already had, she simply nodded and said she could work with that. 3 weeks later, she came back with something I had to read twice before it fully became real. Richard was a senior executive at a regional financial institution. Had been for over a decade. And the picture she assembled: corporate accounts accessed for personal use. High-end gambling trips funded through company channels. A pattern of expenditures obscured carefully but not carefully enough was not a suspicion. It was a documented, sourced, cross-referenced record. And get this, while I was sitting at that table every night building the most thorough document I have ever put together in my life. Richard was out there living his life, smiling at people, running his meetings 4 minutes early, completely certain his world was exactly as solid and untouchable as it had always been. The arrogance of a man who has never once been held accountable is a very specific, very recognizable thing. I had seen it on his porch the day he smiled at me. I recognized it now for exactly what it was. I spent 2 more weeks building what I privately called the package. 50 pages, organized, cross-referenced, specific, the kind of document that does not leave room for practice, calm, or charm, or reasonable-sounding explanations. The kind that speaks entirely for itself. I addressed it to the IRS whistleblower office, to the state attorney general, and to the chief executive of the institution where Richard spent his days managing other people's money. I sealed those envelopes on a Sunday evening, set them on the counter, looked at Duke's collar on the hook, and I felt something I had not felt in weeks. Ready. The emergency home meeting was my idea. I requested it formally by the book. The only way I was going to play any of this. I listed the reason as financial concerns requiring community review. Vague enough that Richard probably read it as noise. The neighbor with the dog, making one last frustrated attempt to cause problems. Let the man vent, handle it the way he always handled everything, close it down and move on. He had no idea what had been sitting in federal mailboxes for 4 days already. The meeting was a Tuesday evening. Strong turnout, about 30 homeowners packed into the community room, folding chairs in uneven rows, the low social hum of people who all live within 2 blocks of each other. Richard arrived 4 minutes early, coffee in hand, working the room at the door, shaking hands, easy smile running at full power, at ease, performing competence the way he had performed it for 11 years straight. I had brought binders, 20-6 of them, identical. 1 per household in that room, each one containing the same documents, the HOA financial records, the LLC registration in his brother-in-law's name, the cross-reference transaction history, the investigator's report, the entire pattern laid out so clearly that you would have to actively try to misread it. I let the meeting open the normal way, pleasantries, minutes from the last session. Richard at the front of the room in that easy, authoritative posture I had watched him hold for years. Completely comfortable. Completely home. Then I raised my hand. I have some documents I think the community should see. I kept my voice completely level. No theater, no dramatics. I just stood up and started setting binders on the chairs around me, and people started picking them up. And the room went from normal conversation quiet to a completely different kind of quiet, the kind where everyone is reading the same page and nobody is talking because nobody knows what to say yet. I watched Richard's face. He noticed the binders before he could read them. I saw it happen in real time. His coffee cup went still. His eyes tracked the room, calculating, and then they found mine. And I watched the exact moment of the specific, unmistakable moment when the charm fell. Not all at once. It came down in layers. First the smile, then the ease in his shoulders, then that polished, practiced confidence that had held this neighborhood in its palm for over a decade. What was left underneath was Something I had not seen on Richard's face before. Fear. Small, quiet, completely real. The questions from the room started slowly, and then came without stopping. How long had this been going on? Where had the money gone? What was this company? Richard attempted a response, but twice I watched him reach for the language that had always worked, the measured tone, the reasonable explanation that closes things down. It was not there. He could not find it. For possibly the first time in 11 years, the man had walked into a room completely unprepared, and every single person in it could see it happening. Can you imagine? I did not need to say another word after that first sentence. The envelopes had been mailed for days before the meeting. By the time this room was reading those binders, the relevant authorities already had everything they needed to begin. I had not organized this meeting to build the case. The case was already built, already moving, already beyond anything Richard could redirect or charm his way around. I organized it for one reason, so that every person who had trusted him, thanked him, handed him their dues, and believed he was protecting their community could look at exactly who he was. Within 48 hours, the institution where Richard worked placed him on immediate administrative leave. By the end of the week, the leave had become a termination for gross professional misconduct. Richard, the man who had entered that building with authority every morning for over a decade, was walked out of it permanently. 2 weeks later, the kind of official attention you cannot charm or deflect arrived at his door. His accounts were frozen. The formal process that begins when multiple agencies take simultaneous interest in the same person had started, and it moved in one direction only. His wife retained legal counsel within days, not to defend him, but to separate herself from what was coming. She saw the same wall everyone else could now read. With no income and no access to his accounts, the mortgage did not get paid. And then the next month. And then the one after that. Exactly 6 months after the afternoon I lost Duke, I sat on my front porch with a cup of coffee. The morning light was coming through the oaks. The street was quiet, and I watched Richard stand on his lawn, the immaculate, perfectly maintained, fiercely guarded lawn he had treated like something sacred, holding a single cardboard box while the bank's representatives completed the process that ends with the locks changed and the driveway emptied. Why? A man who had spent 11 years building a kingdom in 40 blocks, being walked off the last piece of it. He did not look in my direction. I did not need him to. Real justice does not feel like a victory lap. I want to be clear about that. It does not feel triumphant or loud or like anything you have seen in a movie. It feels like the first full breath you have taken in 6 months. Like a weight you had been carrying so long you forgot what it felt like to stand up straight has finally, completely, set itself down. I still think about Duke every single day. Not the end of it, just Duke. The way he used to sit on my feet.